Former President Trump has responded to the Supreme Court's decision on his taxes. The court ruled to allow a New York prosecutor to obtain his tax returns from up to 10 years ago. Trump is calling the move just another political attack against him. The U.S. Supreme Court is throwing out a number of 2020 election lawsuits that still remain. Among them, challenges to election processes and election results in several states. And two House Democrats are asking cable providers what they have done to combat so-called misinformation surrounding the 2020 election. The FCC commissioner calls this an attempt to stifle free speech. Tune into Deep Dive as we explore these topics and more. Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. A sad milestone today. The U.S. has passed 500,000 lost to the virus in a year. The Biden administration participated in a moment of silence, and all flags on federal buildings will be at half-staff for the next 5 days to honor those lost. It's almost the same amount of Americans who perished to both world wars combined. White House officials said 500 candles were placed on the steps and balcony to represent the 500,000 lives lost to the virus. And the House Budget Committee approved Biden's $1.9 trillion in new coronavirus relief. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying we must act swiftly to put an end to this pandemic and to stem the suffering felt by so many millions. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell saying on the Senate floor further aid needs to be smartly targeted so government doesn't get in the way. But Democrats want to double down on Band-Aid policies like they are planning for another year of stagnation instead of trying to set up success. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, meanwhile, saying the bill is on track to be approved by both chambers and sent to Biden for his signature before March 14th. Budget Committee Republicans pushed back on the price tag, which follows $4 trillion in COVID-19 aid last year. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy saying on Fox News that only 9% of this massive bill will be spent fighting the pandemic. He calls the bill, quote, too expensive and too expansive. Speaking of Fox News, it's one of the broadcasters targeted in a congressional letter to cable providers. Two House Democrats are calling on cable providers to combat the spread of so-called misinformation surrounding the 2020 election. The letter suggested conservative media outlets played, quote, a major role in the spread of dangerous misinformation that enabled the insurrection of January 6th and hinders our public health response to the current pandemic. The Democrats asked what the cable companies are doing to stop the spread of what they call misinformation. On Tuesday, two House Democrats on the committee from California sent a letter to 12 cable companies like Comcast and AT&T. They also sent a letter to Spectrum, Dish, Verizon, Roku, Amazon, Apple, and Google. The committee leaders said some broadcasters and cable networks' increasing reliance on conspiracy theories and misleading our patently false information raises questions about their devotion to journalistic integrity. In reference to conspiracy theories, the committee is presumably referring to news coverage of election fraud. That's after the presidential election that was riddled with irregularities and allegations of election fraud, with hundreds of witnesses refuting the results. The House Committee on Energy and Commerce is set to meet Wednesday to address the media's role in promoting disinformation. Two Democrat leaders in the committee pointed to the prolonged severity of the CCP virus pandemic and the Capitol siege. They claimed these occurrences suggest disinformation on news media presents a destabilizing threat. Fox is one of the accused news media that these cable companies carry. Fox said in a statement that for individual members of Congress to highlight political speech they do not like and demand cable distributors to engage in viewpoint discrimination sets a terrible precedent. Newsmax is another media the cable providers carry. It told the New York Times it defends its election coverage and calls the letter an attack on free speech. The Commissioner of Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, issued his own response, calling it a chilling violation of free speech rights. Carr writes to the House Democrats that use their official letterhead to launch this inquiry, I would say this: your demand to know the moral principles that guide a private entity's decision about what news to carry cannot be reconciled with bedrock principles of free speech and journalistic freedom. Carr says by writing letters to cable providers, Democrats are telling them they will pay a price if the news media they carry doesn't conform to the Democrats' political narratives. He says the two House Democrats had selectively targeted several news media outlets for their coverage of political events. He reminded Americans that discourse on matters of public interest should be, quote, robust, uninhibited, and wide open, adding more speech is better than less. Yet the concerted effort by Democrats to drive political dissent from the public square represents a marked departure from these First Amendment norms. A newsroom's decision about what stories to cover and how to frame them should be beyond the reach of any government official, not targeted by them. Another top official at the FCC, Nathan Symington, echoed his sentiments, writing, "This is particularly concerning because the House Energy and Commerce Committee supervises the Communications Act, and their statement could be read to imply that action will be taken under the Communications Act should the recipients not agree in advance to chill their speech." He ended by saying he trusts the American people to make up their own minds regarding to whom they choose to listen. Now for some updates. Trump has issued a response to the Supreme Court ruling against him regarding his tax returns in the state of New York. Trump called it a continuation of the greatest political witch hunt in the history of our country and says this is something which has never happened to a president before. He says the investigation into him is Democrat-inspired in a totally Democrat location. Other New York Democrats, like Attorney General Letitia James, have previously launched probes or taken action against Trump or his business, arguing he's broken the law. Trump called the targeting part of a new phenomenon of headhunting prosecutors and attorneys general, who he alleged try to take down their political opponents using the law as a weapon. He says the phenomenon is a threat to the very foundation of our liberty and that it's what's done in third world countries. Trump says that he will fight on, as he has over the last 5 years, despite all of the election crimes committed against him, and that he will win. The Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr.'s office hasn't publicly said what it is investigating, but some details have emerged in court filings that suggest prosecutors are seeking evidence of possible falsification of records, as well as insurance and tax fraud. Vance is seeking 10 years of tax returns. It's part of a probe in a possible state tax fraud by Trump. And a quick recap, in August 2019, Vance issued a subpoena for Trump's tax returns, which Trump blocked since he was still a sitting president and has immunity from criminal investigators at the time. Last July, the Supreme Court rejected Trump's claim. Trump countered, saying it was politically motivated. A few months later, in October, the court ruled against that too. So Trump's team took it back to the court again, putting the subpoena on hold. With the latest ruling, Vance's office can see Trump's tax records. Trump's accounting firm Meier USA has said it is not contesting the subpoena and will comply with the legal obligations. As Trump is no longer in office, he's also no longer enjoying immunity. A criminal conviction would be unprecedented, as no former president has ever been charged with a crime, much less convicted for one. And on the topic of the country's highest court, the Supreme Court also threw out a number of 2020 election lawsuits that still remained. 3 justices disagreed with the move for one of the cases. The case was an appeal of a ruling made by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The lower court changed election rules without the consent of the state legislature, which Republicans argue is unconstitutional. The ruling allowed mail-in ballots that arrived 3 days after November 3rd to be counted, while state law requires them to be received by 8 p.m. on Election Day. Justices Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, and Neil Gorsuch dissented from the Supreme Court's decision not to hear the appeal. In his dissent, Justice Thomas expressed frustration, writing the decision to leave election law hidden beneath a shroud of doubt is baffling. He wrote, "By doing nothing, we invite further confusion and erosion of voter confidence. Our fellow citizens deserve better and expect more from us." Thomas wrote that decision to rewrite the rule seems to have affected too few ballots to change the outcome of any federal election, but that may not be the case in the future. Adding, these cases provide us with an ideal opportunity to address just what authority non-legislative officials have to set election rules, and to do so well before the next election cycle. The refusal to do so is inexplicable. Other lawsuits dismissed include a case brought by attorney Lynn Wood against Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, challenging results and policies in Georgia. A lawsuit from Arizona challenging Biden's victory. 2 appeals over the state of Wisconsin. One lodged by Trump against the state's election results. The court also rejected attorney Sidney Powell's case alleging widespread election fraud in Michigan. Despite the sweeping rejection of cases, a handful of lawsuits still remain to be heard by the Supreme Court. Those include Powell's other cases and a separate Trump campaign challenge in Wisconsin. Another case that was dismissed was one brought by Representative Mike Kelly, challenging mail-in voting policies in Pennsylvania. One of Kelly's lawyers told the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette last week that it is important the court should take an interest in whether Pennsylvania's election laws are administered constitutionally or not, and in accordance with the Pennsylvania Constitution and with the federal Constitution. But what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.